Hi, good evening. We're expecting quite a few more people, but since we are a fairly intimate group, I wanted to ask people to move forward if they would, so that we can, in deference to our speakers, but also to me, because I have a terrible voice tonight. But if you could move forward, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. To get the ball rolling. Thank you, Janice.
Okay, I'll give up taking the bus or seating here.
Thank you so much. I think that way we can have more of a fruitful conversation. My name is Caroline Hanna, and I am Associate Curator here at the Bard Graduate Center. And it was my privilege to work very closely with the late David Jaffe, who was the faculty curator of the New York Crystal Palace, 1853, which I hope if you have not seen, you will take time to come see in our building down the block. It is my great privilege to introduce our speakers tonight. Glenn Adamson is currently Senior Scholar at the Yale Center for British Art and Editor-at-Large of the magazine Antiques, a curator and theorist who works across the fields of design, craft, and contemporary art. He was, until March 2016, the director of the Museum of Arts and Design here in New York, where, among other projects, he was the driving force behind the groundbreaking exhibition, New York City Makers, the Mad Biennial, in 2014, which showcased many of the creative communities thriving across the 5 boroughs by exhibiting the works, products, and in some cases environments of over 100 diverse makers across a wide range of fields. Before that, Glenn had a distinguished career as head of research at the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and curator at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. His publications include The Art in the Making, 2016, co-authored with Julia Bryan Wilson, Invention of Craft, 2013, Postmodernism, Style and Subversion, 2011, which was also a major exhibition at the V&A, The Craft Reader, 2010, and an anthology that I have relied on in my own teaching and thinking through craft in 2007. He was also a founding editor of the Journal of Modern Craft, which he continues to co-edit with other leaders in the field, including Alyssa Author, visiting lecturer here at Bard Graduate Center. A longtime friend of the Bard Graduate Center, Glenn received an Iris Award in 2013, and as I recall, was a visiting scholar, although briefly, I believe, at one time, around that time. Glenn will speak first, and then be joined by Debera Johnson, who, as many of you know, is the founder and executive director of the Center for Sustainable Design Strategies at Pratt Institute, and has been leading the integration of sustainability and technology into Pratt's academic programs for over 15 years. Where she was also the head of the and I'm forgetting the department, the industrial design.
Industrial design program.
Before that, she also founded the Pratt Design Incubator, now the Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator, in 2002, which links sustainability, technology, entrepreneurship, and production by mentoring emerging ventures and research in apparel-related fields, from concept development to manufacturing to market. Recently, the Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator, which is a 21,000 square foot hub for ethical fashion and design startups in New York City, was awarded a $1.5 million grant in federal and city funding to develop an innovation center for activated materials ICAM, I believe it's called, focused on advancing the manufacture of smart garments and textiles. And I, for one, am very interested to learn how that might improve my life. I am very pleased to welcome these two engaging and distinguished thinkers who will speak on what making in New York City means today and learn how today's issues may be related or perhaps not relate to the aspirations behind the subject of our current focus exhibition, New York Crystal Palace. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I want to say a hello to our virtual audience because we are streaming. So towards the end of the Q&A, I will repeat your questions so that folks out there who are watching at home can follow along. It's, of course, a great pleasure for me always to come here to the Bard Graduate Center, a place for which I have a lot of affection and which really exemplifies a lot of the values that I'm going to be speaking about during my brief remarks here to kick off the evening. And I think the most important of those has to do with the role of theory and history in relation to practice construed in a very broad and expansive sense. And that's why I'm so glad to be joined by Deb, because if you like, tonight I'm theory and history and Deb is practice. So this is where the rubber meets the road. The BFDA, in particular the Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator that Deb will talk about during our conversation later, is just an absolutely world-beating example of all the things that I'm going to be trying to talk about. So it's really fantastic to be joined by you tonight, Deb. So what I'm going to do is give you a kind of two-part lecture. The first, of course, will be about the Crystal Palace, New York Crystal Palace. And I trust that you've all seen the exhibition or indeed had some role in curating it in some cases. If you haven't, it is next door, and you won't be able to see it tonight because it closes at 8, but do come back and see it. It's a small but powerful exhibition about a very little-known phenomenon in design history. And we might just start here. It's funny that it's so little known because it is based directly on perhaps the best-known thing that's ever happened in the history of design, which of course was the 1851 Great Exhibition, which was located in Hyde Park in London, which was the instigator of the whole South Kensington institutional infrastructure around design, culminating, of course, in the creation of what became the Victoria and Albert Museum, where I spent 8 years working. So the Crystal Palace in London could not be more widely recognized as the kind of epicenter of the emergence of modern design. And as I'll talk about, that had a number of different platforms to it, all of which were replicated here in miniature in the New York Crystal Palace. This was located in Bryant Park and had only a very brief incarnation as the original Crystal Palace exhibition, the exhibition of the industry of all nations, as it was called. And in fact, the building met its untimely fate only 5 years later in so it opened in 1853 and burned down in 1858. It had been used for other purposes during the ensuing years, and it was during one of those exhibitions that a mishap led to this conflagration. Strangely enough, the London Crystal Palace, as you all probably know, also burned, although it took a considerably longer time for that to happen. It was relocated from its original location in Hyde Park elsewhere in London, and it burned down in the 1920s. So both of these very iconic modern buildings, which in so many ways seem to anticipate international style architecture and their light iron frame construction with glass transparent panels inset, both of these buildings unfortunately did not survive, so we don't have them to look at today. There is an absolutely wonderful thing over in the show, however, which is a little chunk of glass, which it's like a piece of the true cross of modern design history in America that you can go and see, and it looks for all the world like something that you might have seen in a Miami hotel built in the 1920s, but in fact it was originally part of this building. So why do we care about these events, the Crystal Palace in London, and of course the New York Crystal Palace that brings us all here tonight? Well, the first and most important thing perhaps is that these were world events. So they were extremely self-conscious stages on which the making of all nations could be gathered together. And of course, by gathering these things together, they were implicitly compared. So in this panoramic sort of impossible view that you have in the exhibition, you have a sense of the different countries. I hope you can see that they're actually emblazoned above the relevant displays. The different countries are being compared against one another. It's as if you've walked into an encyclopedia and are paging through it, except that you're doing it with your body. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. So partly it's the geographical range of what there was to be seen, which allowed each country to assess itself, to assess its own achievements. So if you are, say, Brazil, and you show up with only raw materials, because you think maybe that's what the exhibition is going to be about, and then you are faced with the combined cabinet making, metalworking, engineering, ceramics industry of these more modern nations, it will form a powerful spur to you to come back better next time. Of course, within Europe itself, it is an intensely competitive phenomenon, maybe comparable only to, soccer these days might be a good comparison. It's like the kind of dynamic of the World Cup. But of course, it's not a proxy for economy, it is economy. And that is the other aspect of it that, of course, one can't avoid, which is that it's about imperial dynamics. And the more powerful European countries have the larger displays or are controlling the material that's coming from elsewhere, like the famous India Court in the South Kensington version of the Crystal Palace. So if you like, for all of its scale, and these were large events, of course the one in London much larger than the one here in New York, but these exhibitions were microcosms as well. They self-consciously set out to capture the entire economy of the world, the knowledge of the world, the current innovations and forward-looking manufacturing projects of everywhere, and bring them all into one building. And of course, in a building that itself was literally transparent, literally like a kind of viewfinder. So when we look back at this event and start to think about what its relevance might be for us today, what's interesting is that each of the specific inclusions in the Crystal Palace seems to anchor a narrative that can be spooled forward to the present. And because we have Deb here, I thought I'd start with sewing machines. So here's the Singer's sewing machine. You can actually see the real thing over in the exhibition. This I thought was a maybe clearer image to show you of this, very well-dressed worker, who seems like she's garbed more for salon discourse than for labor, using one of these new fangled sewing machines. And so, there's an obvious story here, which is a story about mechanical innovation and new products being released upon the market. There are some unobvious aspects to those obvious stories. So, for example, my colleague Christopher Wilk, who's at the V&A and running the furniture, textiles, and fashion department there, is about to open an exhibition about the history of plywood. And why do I mention that? Because it turns out that the largest manufacturer of plywood in the 19th century was Singer, because they were making the cases for their sewing machines. And it was the shipping, the packing and shipping of the sewing machines that led to the formation of the modern plywood industry, along with the manufacturing of tea crates, which of course is a classic imperial product, the tea, and a classic industrial product, these sewing machines with their interchangeable parts adapted from gun manufacture. So as I say, there's some obvious lines of inquiry that these objects that were showcased in the Crystal Palace exhibitions certainly lead to, but there's maybe some less obvious ones as well. And this is the other reason why I wanted to show this particular image, because of course one of the stories is the history of gender, and gender in relation to labor. Now, women were of course not included in the labor force, the industrial labor force, in the early 19th century in most European countries or in America. They had been included, of course, in the agricultural labor force, and they were domestic, unwaged laborers, let's not forget. But although previously, as in the case of pin making, for example, or stocking, knitting, using frames, women had been involved in those industries, but in the early 19th century, you have a kind of nadir in the history of women going to work. and we can have a, perhaps a long conversation, longer than we have time for here today, about Victorian norms regarding gender, regarding the appropriateness of labor and employment. But in the middle of the 19th century, there were a few things that were thought to be particularly appropriate for women to do, and one of those was sewing, precisely because it was based on a domestic accomplishment that women were taken to have mastered anyway. There was also a rather fraudulent conception that women were better at things that involved fine motor control, just because they were built that way, which of course now looks like a very thinly disguised pretext to put women to work in extremely repetitive, deadening tasks that required or indeed admitted very little creativity or design input. So lace work is another one of these, sewing, and then another fascinating one is typing, which was explicitly compared to another domestic accomplishment, which was playing the piano. And I have to say, I always thought this was a little bit of a reach until, while preparing for this this talk, I found this, which wasn't actually put into the original New York Crystal Palace display of 1853, but it was shown in the building in 1857 in a subsequent industrial presentation. And this is a patent typewriter, patented in 1857 by Samuel Ward Francis. And as you can see, it uses a piano keyboard as the means of making the keys depress. So here you have this kind of locus of thinking about how to get women into the workforce. And it's, again, not the sort of thing that you would necessarily consider to be a milestone in the history of feminism, but in its way it was. It's sort of like Rosie the Riveter 100 years previously with opposite gender politics, right? So here you have this object that's being used as a mechanism, literally, to get women to work in a way that was seen to be appropriate. I've been alluding a couple of times to the fact that this exhibition space was also architecturally spectacular and, of course, very novel in its construction. And here I just want to make reference to a very well-known essay, which is called The Exhibitionary Complex by a historian called Tony Bennett. And I don't know if those of you who are Bard students have probably been forced to read this. Anne, have you been forced to read this yet? If not, go have a look at it. It's a sort of profoundly influential essay about the history of the formation of the museum. And let's not forget that when the 1853 Crystal Palace opened in New York, there were no museums in New York, certainly not of this scale, right? You had Peale's Museum down in Philadelphia, which had a certain scale, but nothing like this. So the Metropolitan doesn't exist. None of our other museums exist. So this is what public viewing experience is all about. And the key point that Bennett makes, which I think is so brilliant, and he's talking about the 1851 Crystal Palace in London, but the point holds very much for New York as well. He says, what is the most important thing that's on display in the Crystal Palace? And the answer is, of course, the people, the public. And they're looking at one another. And as you can see, there are viewing platforms, almost like you would have at the opera in Paris. And you've all seen these movies where people have their opera glasses and they're looking at one another and there are these exchanges of glances, right? So the Crystal Palace architecture creates a theater of the public itself, looking at itself, a kind of self-encounter, if you will. So part of the rationale, visual rhetoric of the building is that it is a viewing device in which people see themselves as a mass, and implicitly as a kind of democratic mass, and as a group who are collectively involved in some project. And of course, as Bennett argues persuasively, that project is itself modernity, what comes to be called modernity. And depending on one's political persuasion, one will draw very different conclusions about that. This is, let's not forget, the decade when Marx is starting to have his greatest influence through writing his Communist Manifesto, etc. There are, in fact, a lot of labor strikes around the exhibitions that happen in not so much the 1851 exhibition, but the 1862 exhibition, its sort of follow-up that happens in London, is plagued by labor unrest. And in fact, by that time, the organizers of the exhibition are concerned about proceeding simply because they're worried about having so many workers in one place to put the building together and bring everything in. And they think that might be quite dangerous, actually, an opportunity for insurrection, for some kind of seditious activity because of the scale. So depending on one's point of view, this grouping together of the public can be interpreted in very different ways. It can be seen as the consuming classes that are going to learn about good design and learn about objects that they will be able to go to buy. It could be construed to be addressed to the artisanal classes who might study the objects that are on display and then use those experiences to inform their own work. It could be the political classes seeing themselves, which is the more left-wing way of interpreting this encounter. And all of these conversations that, as I'll get to in a minute, we're still experiencing today, in a real sense do start here. And you can think about this next time you go to a museum, when you go to the Met. To what extent are you seeing a cross-section of humanity? To what extent is it an elitist experience? To what extent is it a truly general experience of public-mindedness? Those conversations all start in these spaces. And the last thing that I think is important to say about the architecture is that, of course, it is a sequential experience. So it's something that you witness through time. It's not a single encounter through, let's say, a conversation that you might have in a cabinet of curiosities, a 17th century model of display which carried on to the 18th century. Because of its scale, and again, its transparency, and also its regularity, you notice how the architecture repeats unit after unit after unit. You have the sense that you are walking through a constant process of unveiling and discovery and revelation. So every step you take, you are being greeted with some new object that presents you with information and stimulation. It's like you're in a kind of telescope. You're actually in the barrel of the telescope, and the lens is presenting itself to you as you go along, if I can put it that way. And clearly this has something to do with the concept of enlightenment that is inherited from the 18th century, but it also has a very specific 19th century quality in the sense of its being truly comprehensive. So, as I said, it's like walking through an encyclopedia, and in fact, as you see in the exhibition, there were these enormous publications that I think the label, I'm not sure which one of the students wrote it, but the label on the wall next to this encyclopedia says that it actually makes for very dry reading. But from the 19th century point of view, the completeness of it, the empirical totalism of it was absolutely crucial, and the experience of literally walking through the space and having it unscroll past you was comparable to that. So highly didactic. So now I just want to focus in on a couple of other things that have weird echoes in the present day before I get to the making thing. So we're going to start the transition to talking about 1853 and 2017. One that really struck me, because I happened to write in my column in Magazine Antiques about it last year, is that it was one of the first times that anybody saw police uniforms in American history. So here they are. And the reason this happened was because of this guy, George Matsell, who had recently been appointed the commissioner of the New York City Police. And there's a complicated story here that has to do with party politics, Democrats versus Republicans, even then, fighting for control over the constabulary. Long story short, New York City had been policed by a rather informal night watch for decades and decades, going back into the 17th century. And Matsell was part of a highly contested political maneuver to bring that informal force of officers into a more regulated system. And as part of that effort, he made them wear uniforms, which they hated because they thought that it replaced their individuality with a kind of military identity, which was seen to be completely inappropriate at first. And it's a little bit hard to recover this period in the history of policing, but the idea of a badge of authority literally had to be invented. And therefore it's very interesting that you have his actual badge over in the exhibition, and his nightstick. And I'm going to show you a different nightstick that he owned. I'm sorry it's such a crap picture, but this is the best that I can get from the New York Historical Society without them going and taking a $500 photograph for me. So here it is. So this is another nightstick that he owned. He had 2 of them that survive in the NYHS collection. And I'm absolutely fascinated by this one because it's basically the 2 objects that are in the exhibition fused into one. So you have the nightstick with the badge, like a sheriff's badge, actually on the end, as if it were some kind of mace. And you can imagine the kind of damage that you could do with something like this, right? And it's not incidental, because at this time, the police were not generally armed with firearms. So the way that they would fight is with these billy clubs, or saps, or whatever you want to call them, sticks. And they would kill people with them, sometimes, including sometimes each other during these police, these internecine police battles that would occur. However, this nightstick seems to have been intended for ceremonial use. So I'm not exactly sure what the circumstances of these events would have been, but you can imagine a kind of benevolent ball type of a situation with Matzel presiding, and he has this nightstick as his scepter, like a medieval king, if you like. And it's so interesting to me that the first New York police commissioner would have had as his symbolic totemic object a weapon. Because, of course, today, when we think about police and weaponry, we think about black men being shot in the streets. We think about scenes like this. This is taken from a documentary called Do Not Resist, which is about the weaponization of the American police force. And this is, stay with me here because this is a little bit hard to believe, but this is called an MRAP, which MRAP, which basically means it's an armored anti-personnel mine vehicle. And what happened was that as the Iraq War unfolded over the many years that it's been going on, the military hardware that was being used in that context became obsolete from the point of view of the military. So what did the US government do? They gave it away to our police departments. So this is an MRAP, still in its desert camouflage paint, riding down a street in rural Wisconsin, past a white picket fence and playground equipment. And it's a kind of stunning thing. But in a way, this kind of scene seems to me directly descended from an object like this one, and from someone like Matzel and what he was trying to do. And of course, we can't think about policing without confronting the question of violence and the appropriate necessity of violence, because if you take violence out of the hands of police, you don't have police anymore, right? That's endemic to the strategy of how you maintain public safety. So weirdly, we can see in the 1853 Crystal Palace not just the origins of modern architecture, but also the origins of modern policing as we have it today. Other examples of that, which I'll go through a little bit more quickly, guns. This is the display that Samuel Colt put together for the 1853 Crystal Palace. Absolutely fascinating. It looks kind of like shell work, 18th century domestic shell work. And the fact that Colt would have taken these new improved repeater pistols and put them in this decorative shield strikes me as one of the signally bizarre things of the fair. Hard to understand in a way, except that, of course, they were being presented as accoutrements, as appropriate, the appropriate accoutrements of a gentleman. So Colt, you have to remember, is one of the great innovators of marketing of the 19th century. So he's doing things like, for example, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of it, but he does the first ever paid product placement in history, as far as we know. He actually pays painters like George Catlin to paint scenes of his Colts in action out there on the frontier shooting Indians, for example. And he is also, of course, a great technological innovator. And so here he uses the language of ornament as a way of communicating these new products. And fast forward again to 2017, we can think about the way that guns are being marketed today as appropriate accoutrements for gentlemen of a certain class, certain parts of the country, and the way that those communications are happening as well. And in fact, cult can be seen as the origin point, in many ways, of the conversation about firearms that we're having today. Do we actually need guns that are this good, that can shoot this many times per second? That's something that Colt started to introduce through his use of the repeater. Do we really want our gun manufacturers to have unbridled license to advertise their products any way that they choose, such that, for example, they appeal to children? Do we like that idea, or do we not like that idea, etc.? And then I'll just make one cheap little point, which is that the second commissioner of the fair of the Crystal Palace was none other than Phineas T. Barnum, P.T. Barnum, the circus guy, the greatest huckster of the 19th century. And whether or not that has any connection to 2017, I will just leave to your own discretion. Passing lightly on. What we're here to talk about, though, is, of course, making. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time. So this is a rosewood sofa by Julius Dessoir. You have a related chair over in the exhibition. So this does date from 1853. It's thought to have been displayed at the Crystal Palace in New York. Decorative arts nerds, I should note, the upholstery is replaced, but the rosewood is all real. And I want to use this as an emblematic object to talk about 19th century attitudes to craft. So a few years ago, I wrote a book called The Invention of Craft, and I'm not going to try to repeat or rehearse the whole argument for you today, but I want to zero in on one aspect of what I wrote about in that study, which is the question of why furniture like this came to be seen as emblematic of everything that craft should not be. Okay, so what you're going to get in the ensuing decades, obviously, is the arts and crafts movement, aided and abetted by the writings of John Ruskin and William Morris. Eventually you get Gustav Stickley and the other arts and crafts reformers of the late 19th, early 20th century. And you know what Stickley furniture looks like, right? It's oak and it's straight. And there's no carving on it, or very little anyway. Big, overstated mortise and tenon joints, that kind of deal. It's like Flintstone furniture compared to this. And you know, we're so used to this story of Victorian material culture being seen as machine production that is debased aesthetically and ethically, and the arts and crafts movement as the moment when the interests of the artisan, joy in labor, all of that is reinserted into design history, and the deadly, dreadful objects of the 19th century are deposed. But look at this piece of furniture. And I ask you, could you have made this with a 19th century machine? Obviously not. Maybe some aspects of it, maybe the maybe the legs were roughed out on a lathe of some kind, maybe even a replicating lathe, though I think that's very, very unlikely. But that might be just about it. You know, the original upholstery might have been woven on a jacquard loom, but even that would have involved highly skilled weavers at various stages of the process of making the textile. And as for the rosewood itself, clearly it's carved by hand and to an extremely high standard. And if you go over to look at the chair in the show, you'll see what I mean. So how is it that this kind of furniture came to be seen as somehow anti-craft, or as a kind of besmirched stain on the reputation of artisans? Well, I think that has a lot to do with the organization of labor rather than the execution of it. And again, this is something I argue in my book, Invention of Craft. But the real problem with this kind of furniture is not that it's badly made, or that it's unskilled, or that it's reliant on machines, because clearly none of those things are true. The reason is because the artisans who made it were not working to their own designs, and they were also not enjoying particularly high standards of living or wages. And also, conversely, increasingly they were unionizing. And if you think of the history of craft reform in the late 19th century as taking two broad currents, which will never meet again until arguably today, you can think of it as the arts and crafts movement, as in William Morris, going off in one direction, and the union movement going off in another direction. And when you first start thinking about this, you might say to yourself, well, this is very puzzling because we know that William Morris was a devout socialist, committed socialist. So why did he not just join forces with the unions and fall in league with labor organizing as the way to uplift the artisan? Well, the reason is because what he was interested in, it was joy in labor. He was not interested in higher wages. And in fact, one of the key precepts of the labor movement was that you should have to work as few hours as possible, right? You're trying to get the 8-hour workday. That doesn't sound like joy in labor, right? So what Morris is doing is something that's very aesthetic in its commitments, romantic, backward-looking, of course, to the Middle Ages. What the union movement is doing is very much organized around labor structure, around compensation issues. And those two things do not match up easily. And as I say, it's a divergence that carries on right through the rest of the 20th century. The individualistic aestheticizing mode of the arts and crafts movement on one hand, and the more bureaucratic political framework in which the actual large population of working class people are going to be maneuvering, which tends to leave the arts and crafts movement, of course, as isolated in a kind of boutique area of intellectual thought, and the labor effort as being completely divorced from aesthetics. And you can see that huge divergence in the history of making as originating in an object like this, which someone like Ruskin or Morris would have condemned for what they called its trade finish. Trade finish, meaning that it had no sensibility of an individual maker. It had been brought up to a standard that was imposed across a whole industry. So every sofa that was made by this factory would come out looking the same. It wouldn't be Glenn's work, right? It wouldn't have that sense of soul or individuality to it. Never mind the fact that it's beautifully made, that doesn't actually matter from the point of view of joy in labor, because you can do exquisite craftsmanship and be miserable while you do it, or be exploited while you do it. And this is why Morris not only had no time for this kind of furniture making, but indeed all of the extraordinary crafts of the Victorian period. Think about the construction of the Crystal Palace itself. Well, Morris, when he was young, he was quite young, only a teenager, but famously he refused to go in, and he sulked outside as his family went in and walked around this London Crystal Palace. He had no interest in that kind of architectural building. He had no interest in bridges, no interest in train stations, no interest in pressed glass, no interest in the textile mills of the North as they existed. In fact, those were, famously the satanic mills that had to be overthrown through tapestry making by hand. So this is the framework in which an object like this one sits. And you can then take that same logic over to the question of consumption. And so here I'm showing you the stand of John Gainan, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who was who's been in this project sort of taken up as the archetypal salesman of the 1853 Crystal Palace, and you can see why in this absolutely amazing display, which uses all of the the extraordinary skill of 19th century cabinet making, but then crucially is absolutely stuffed to the gills with these objects, such as this hat, which is one that's thought to have been displayed at the Crystal Palace, and there's another one in an absolutely beautiful marbled box over in the show as well. And so you can see another line of fracture starting here, which is to do with the distribution and sales of objects, because of course what this is looking forward to is what? The department store, and particularly department store displays and department store windows, and the idea that these objects, hats, dresses, jewelry, furniture, whatever, are now going to be understood as commodities, and they are going to be completely divorced from their site of manufacture. So when you see Gainan's stand with its profusion of objects of all kinds, as in a department store, you no longer have any relationship to the narrative of making that brought those objects into existence. Instead, what you have is spectacle. You have the objects being placed before you in this shiny profusion. And so that's another divergence that happens around this time and will increase with speed and intensity over the ensuing century with the rise of the department store. Just to kind of finish that part of the story up, it's also just very interesting to note that it's not only in the Crystal Palace building itself that this phenomenon happens, because the Crystal Palace as a motif becomes like an insignia of consumerism itself. So anybody who's sold things in the Crystal Palace, which is to say almost all New York manufacturers who are worth their salt, will use the symbol of the Crystal Palace on their flyers, and you see many examples of that. And particularly sheet music is very interesting. Piano sellers and other instrument makers. There's a fascinating violin over there, which was actually designed by William Sidney Mount, the famous genre painter. So all of these people, once they've shown in the Crystal Palace, then go on to claim that as their kind of stock in trade. So it has this very strong kind of rippling effect through the language of advertising. So that's the kind of broad view of the Crystal Palace. I'm not going to leave it behind. Here you see it in its larger context in the middle of New York City when it was in its prime. The White Palace, looking ahead to the Chicago 1893 World's Fair perhaps, and progenitor of so much. But now I'm going to switch over to our present day and think about what this building has to do with what's happening in New York City now. And I thought I would start by showing you this space, which looks almost exactly the same. Amazing. It's called the New Lab, so over in Brooklyn. And here I want to express gratitude to one of my students over at Parsons. My student's name is Aria Lefterin, and she did a study of this space for me recently in a class, which is how I got interested in it. So what's fascinating about this space is that it dates almost precisely to the period of the Crystal Palace. So it was built originally in the 1850s as a ship construction facility, and then of course saw heavy use during the period of the Civil War for military purposes, and was used right through the 20th century. Eventually, of course, fell into disuse as manufacturing in America, particularly in the northeastern cities, started to decline, and then recently was taken over and turned into this absolutely extraordinary sort of West Coast style, Silicon Valley style hub of innovation. And you can see here one of the kind of cubicles that's set within this space. And it's very interesting to see how the framework of the building, which again technically is very, very similar to what you would have had in Bryant Park in 1853, is now being used as a kind of decorative backdrop again, but for a totally new form of making. And the other reason I wanted to use this picture in particular is because it shows contemporary machinery, including digitally powered machinery in use. And this is what I hope we can get into with Deb after my talk. I have a kind of theory that what's happening now in New York is a return to the situation of the middle of the 19th century, where you had lots of small shops producing things with a very highly conscious mandate to innovate and promoting themselves as such. Now, of course, what's happened between the 1850s and the 20-teens is that you had the rise and absolute decline of American manufacturing on the one hand, and you also had the rise of this individualistic craft movement model of production, and that too has declined, so that the idea of being an expressive maker like Wendell Castle, let's say, if you know his work, or Dale Chihuly, that kind of model, somebody who has a studio with small number of assistants who makes work that's branded with their own identity, their own expressive vision, that too seems to have declined in favor of what is effectively a small batch manufacturing style of production instead. Why is that? Well, the reasons are complicated, but basically the idea of selling extremely expensive one-off furniture or glass or ceramics in a gallery worked great in the 1980s when there was a generation of collectors who were very interested in that. But now that that's gone out of style, those collectors are either dying off in some cases, but certainly no longer acquiring at the same rate, the income stream for the studio craft model of production is no longer there. So younger craft makers are perhaps intuitively, perhaps strategically, finding their ways into places like this, which are much more about creating a product that has innovation at its core rather than necessarily expressive aesthetics, although that can be an element too, as we'll hear from Deb. But crucially is ready to work with distributors of a much broader kind. So it's not just going to be the art gallery model anymore. It might be selling things directly online. It might be selling things through small retail shops. It might be fabricating things that are going to be used by decorators or by architects. There's a huge, huge range of different outputs for these small shops, and you see them absolutely everywhere in New York City now, especially in Brooklyn. Here's another example, which is Pioneer Works, which again was a Civil War era industrial facility, and now has, oh sorry, that's one more picture of the new lab. Here's Pioneer Works. And although it is used as an art gallery in a kind of turbine hall way, this is a show that they had last year on the architectural collective Ant Farm, kind of radical architecture from the 1960s and 70s. So they do this kind of thing, but mostly what they do is to serve as a hub for innovation-based small manufacturing. And of course, here's the BFDA that we'll be hearing about from Deb, which is particularly anchored in fashion, textiles, as we'll hear, as well as other forms of design, very much about new tooling, as well as entrepreneurial models and fostering those. And that brings me to the last topic that I want to address, which is the show that we did at MAD when I was director there in 2014, which was called NYC Makers. And originally we had envisioned it as a biennial, so it was meant to be the first of a series of these projects that would happen every 2 years, taking the measure of either New York or some other city in America and looking at its making culture. And I don't know how many of you will have seen this show. It was a rather overstuffed exhibition, as biennials tend to be. But what we were trying to do was bring in the sum total of the entire making culture, basically the creative economy of the city, specifically looking at people who make things in this way that I've been describing. So individual or small groups who manufacture things that can be then applied to a variety of different contexts. So this was the lobby, which was sort of dominated by these kind of party decorations that were provided by one firm, Lindsay Edelman, the great lighting designer who's based in Brooklyn, did the chandelier. We had handmade arrows going around in a swirl above people's heads. We looked in depth at a crate making company called Box Art, and I had fun by putting this Wendell Castle piece that was in the collection, showing it in its crate, and then writing a label about the crate rather than the Wendell Castle furniture inside. The point being that all makers are dependent on other makers to literally make it possible for them to do what they do. Museums are filled with crates. They have extensive relationships with their crate making companies and shipping companies, but never talk about them or recognize that kind of artisanship. And I wanted to show, again, the persistence of these concerns that are all around us in the city. Another great example of that would be Ralph Pucci's mannequin company. Ralph Pucci is very well known as a furniture retailer as well, kind of high-end furniture retailer. But he also has the city's largest mannequin manufacturing business. So this is the group of mannequins of his that we had in the show itself. And then here you see a shot from his studio, which is this wonderful kind of surrealistic vision of body parts lying around. It's like something from a Georges Bataille essay from the 1930s. But it's so interesting to me that right there on, I think, 17th Street, up on the 6th floor, you have a mannequin manufactory, and it's being done entirely artisanally. There's a guy called Michael Everett. You see him here demonstrating his skills in the museum. We went on to do a whole show about Ralph Pucci's mannequins, as you may know. And so you have this fellow, Michael, who sculpts the mannequins in clay. then they're cast in fiberglass using handmade molds, and then put into production. And he works with designers and artists of all kinds to help him come up with ideas for these things. So, you know, this is a perfect example to me of the kind of making that's happening in the city that's sort of hovering under your level of attention. So you might walk past a set of Pucci mannequins in a department store window, and it never would occur to you to think who made those, where were they made, are they handmade, are they somehow machine made, what's the production narrative behind those. And so one of the main projects of this show, of course, was to recognize the makers, but on a deeper level it was to encourage people to inquire, to wonder, how are the things around us made. For example, have you thought once since you sat down about the chair that you were sitting in? Do you know where it was made? Do you know who made it? Do you know what the materials are, what the processes were that were used to make it? Maybe some of you could make a guess. I bet Deb could. But probably most of you hadn't thought about it till this second, and you would need to conduct some research to find out the answers, which is okay, but it's because we're not in the habit of reading our environment materially. And what we were trying to do in the show is encourage people to do just that. And as I'm saying, my kind of key argument for this evening is that if we undertake that inquiry into material intelligence, the landscape of materiality that's around us, what we will see is that in the 21st century, we are returning to a structure of work and creativity that's actually not that far off from what was prevailing in New York City in the 19th century. Just to leave you with one last image from the show, I just absolutely love this, and I'm kind of showing it to you as a curiosity. So this is a collaboration by two graphic designers called J.K. Keller and Keetra Dean Dixon, and it's as you can see, a lump of wax, and it's dripped sequentially in layers of different colors, and then you cut through it, and you discover that the inside has had type inset into it. And then you pull the type out and you're left with this. And it's almost like to me, it became like this kind of allegory, symbolic object of the layers of making of the city and the way that the city is kind of constantly transforming itself. And I think I just have a couple more images just on the point about the material landscape around us. I thought it might be appropriate to end with just a few images of what's right around me. So Fort Standard furniture makers, right near where I live in Brooklyn. One block, Miriam Elner, glass maker who was featured in NYC Makers, does Very Glomizé. Scott Bodenner lives only one block from me, who makes very expertly designed and crafted textiles. This particular one is called Mixtape, and it's made of salvaged cassette tapes from the 1980s. So he just asks his friends to give him their crates of old tapes, and he weaves them into the weft of these textiles. Sorry, wrong way. And then, of course, there's my local tailor, Gio Hussey, who's from Jamaica, and he didn't make it, but he hemmed all the seams on this jacket that I'm wearing tonight. And then my local hardware guy, run the other way, and this guy has been behind the counter of this hardware store since, I think I'm right in saying 1967, standing in the same spot serving customers. And I live in Prospect Heights, so he's seen the sort of rise and fall economically and then the gentrification of this neighborhood around him, and he's still there selling hardware to people. And he knows, this is unbelievable, but it's true, he knows every building in the vicinity. So if you go to him and say, Jerry, his name's Jerry, my pipes are busted, he'll say, well, what building are you in? And he'll say, okay, I know the plumbing in that building, so you need this washer, right? So he has that kind of knowledge of the immediate environment. And he's not a maker, he's a distribution guy, right? So he's sort of like John Geenan with his big stand. But he is absolutely integrated into the environment. And I asked him, he's probably 70 now, and I asked him what his plans were. Was he going to retire or what? Was he going to hand it on to his kids? And he said, absolutely no way. There's no way that I would let my kids work this hard, first of all, because I would still work 12-hour days, 6 days a week. And anyway, the most valuable thing I have is the bricks and mortar of this place. Actually, not even the bricks and mortar, the plot of land. So if I sell out to a developer who's going to put a high-rise dwelling there, I'm going to make much more money for my family than I could possibly do by handing over the hardware store. So whenever he retires, this place is going to be gone. And that's, the constant churn of New York. But it just reminds you that there's a constant need to replenish and refresh the well of material intelligence. Fortunately, I think we're now getting back to a point where New York, for a variety of factors which we can now discuss, New York is creating a new generation of makers who are connective in new ways. And that has a lot to do with digital platforms, it has a lot to do with tooling, it has a lot to do with certain strategic factors, both at the level of makers and universities and companies, which, as I say, we can discuss now. But I think there's reason to be optimistic, but it's incumbent upon all of us, particularly those of us who are in the design history field, to be aware of this and sensitive to it, and I suppose speak up for it, which is hopefully what I've just done. So thank you very much for listening, and now I'm going to ask Deb to join me at the front of the room.
Do you have a choice?
I'll just sit there. I might actually use my mic.
Okay.
My voice might be a little
I
quiet.
can use
otherwise.
mine too.
Okay.
Keep us even.
So
Wow, that was like incredible.
Oh.
My brain is like sparkling with various things. And I just want to say my grandfather was a crate maker.
Really?
Yeah.
How amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing. So to see that, when I saw that exhibit,
Mhm.
and then to see it again now, it was really quite lovely to, because I've always respected it because there was so much problem solving involved with it.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
why we picked the Wendell Castle, because
Uh-huh.
it's so irregular, so you had to do
Mhm.
all this crazy maneuvering
Yeah,
inside to make it
it's great.
stable. My grandfather grew up on a farm in Kansas, and he was he turned out to eventually to be an aircraft engine designer,
Wow.
but his hobby was wood carving,
Mhm.
and I got to see him carving wood in his basement when I was a kid, and that's how I got interested in craft in the first place. So
Interesting.
grandfathers are important.
They are important.
I wonder
yeah.
what Jerry the hardware man is telling his grandkids, but
And Jerry, the hardware man, brought up a whole other, aspect when I think about, the initiative right now to move the Garment Center over to Brooklyn, and yet you have so much Jerry in the Garment Center and that infrastructure, and you know exactly where to go to get what, and that how difficult it is to replace that. Right? And so what does that look like? What is the infrastructure that surrounds making going to look like as we move further into the 21st century?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I'm talking about in describing this arc
Mhm.
is a return of respect for non-quantifiable knowledge.
Mhm.
That's one way you can think about it.
Mhm.
So often when we talk about craft, we use the phrase tacit knowledge,
Uh-huh.
which that can be romanticized very easily, which I'm always wary of.
Uh-huh.
But if you use it in a more narrow sense of just the opposite of explicit knowledge, things you can write down
Right.
and account for, you can see that a life in craft or a life behind a hardware store counter or in a garment center, it gives you this saturation of knowledge that can be applied to lots of different purposes.
Mhm.
And it's what people actually do have a lot of trouble reproducing in an artificial intelligence
Definitely.
machine, right?
Yeah.
So I always like to use the example that you can build a computer that will beat the best human chess player,
Mhm.
but you can't yet build a computer that can walk across a forest floor.
Mhm. Hmm.
And so there's something about bodily knowledge and embedded knowledge that I think is deeply complex and worth respecting. But
Yeah.
but
you started
yeah.
this by talking about, the academic versus the practical, or
Yeah.
the theory versus the practical. And so the way I would describe that as somebody who's very practical and very not academic in nature is, it's stuff you can't Google,
Yeah.
right? It's just that innate, that thing that, is just held in a very precious way. And I think more and more we're losing that. And I think that's why the making and the kind of the emergence of more and more making is really important, because I think there is something about understanding something very deeply and very intimately that we start to miss as we just go into this very sort of kind of glossed over world.
Well, of course, that might be one reason why it's coming back into focus, because the very fact that you can't Google it tends to highlight its value, because a lot of other things are cheapened
Right.
by Google, right? Like knowing. So, for example, when I was a kid, I tried to get a summer job as a taxi driver, and I went in and was presented with an exam. I grew up in Boston, so I was presented with an exam, which was pretty much how would you drive from this point to that point. And of course I didn't know, because I just learned to drive. So I failed the exam and I didn't get to be a taxi driver, but now I could. So that's a clear example of de-skilling, right? And a lot of
And
the
we all
frontiers
probably
are
feel it.
falling.
You get on in a cab and the driver clicks in Waze
Yeah.
and gets guided
Yeah.
by somebody else than himself.
Right.
And I find that completely annoying and sad. I mean, I want to have the conversation. I want the personality that's attached to that drive. I want somebody who knows that it's 8 o'clock at night and you don't want to go down Flatbush Avenue
Yeah.
past the Barclay Center, because, Prince William happens to be there tonight, rather than somebody who just like drives right into it. I mean, Waze is a help. But I think there's, again, this loss of like reading maps, these things that take real skill, take practice, and become points of pride, individual pride.
I did once have a doctor Google my symptoms, which I found deeply worrying. But
now you can go to Watson, and
Yeah.
Watson's much more appealing.
So, Deb, before we go
Yeah,
any
sure.
further, can I just ask you to say a little bit more about the
Sure.
BFDA?
So the Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator, the BFDA, we're very interested. As I was saying, was said earlier, I used to chair the industrial design program, working with incredibly creative students who would make beautiful, very meaningful work that would turn into portfolio pieces and just evaporate. And it killed me. And some of these ideas really deserved a chance to come out and be products in the world. And that's when I started the Pratt Design Incubator, and it was when I was the chair of industrial design. And then it grew into something larger. When I stepped down as chair, and I wanted to take the incubator with me and grow it so it would represent the whole school. And then I wanted to take it even further than that and say, well, no, we really need to support what happens after college for the whole community of New York City, and to really provide an opportunity for young people to follow their dream of being these people connected to the products they're making and the commercialization of those things. And so that was one big goal for me. And the other was really living my own ethics and values. And I'm very concerned with the environment and very concerned with labor standards and how people are treated when production happens. And so the accelerator really is a very values-based, design-based place where people can come in who are, they come in, they're making beautiful products. They're making maybe $30,000 a year. Right? They're not going to live. It's not a viable business. And our goal is to turn them into companies that are making $300,000 to $500,000 a year, and help them build a roadmap to whatever their aspiration is. So that might be, I want to have a $2 million company, and what's called a lifestyle company, where it's small and they still kind of have their arms wrapped around everything. They're still the designer. They're not sort of subsumed, it's not taken over. Or maybe they want to be somebody like the next Eileen Fisher, who's, $500 million company. So we're really interested in their individual success. And and we mentor them. We become their chief sustainability officer, which they couldn't possibly do at the scale they're at. So we really help them embed these values into their companies. It's called triple bottom line thinking. And work with them so as they scale, their values and these ethics scale with them. and they're not trying to figure it out afterwards, which so many people are trying to do.
Why is it
now.
triple bottom line and not just double?
Oh, I'm sorry. So it's they need to buy financial success is critical. I mean, you don't go anywhere without that. Then the other bottom line is, how have I reduced the impact of the products I'm making? What are the consequences of me making this scarf to the world environmentally? And what's the social value in what I'm doing? How am I treating my labor force? And so you're measuring not just financial success, but your success in improving the environmental impact, reducing the environmental impact, and ensuring that you have, in our case, ethical supply chain.
That, of course, is one thing that the 19th century was supremely unconcerned about, was the environmental impact.
Yeah.
And I should have talked about this, but rosewood is a great example. The harvesting of many of the materials that you would have seen in the Crystal Palace exhibitions
Right.
was, particularly on a social level,
Right.
absolutely
Yeah.
horrendous. I mean, it triggered enormous slave industries that reduced life expectancies of workers to 30 years or less, and essentially huge regimes motivated or propelled by torture. I mean, just the worst of all possible periods in labor history, and that was really what was ending up in these buildings. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
And of course, some environmental damage as well, which gained ground with starting to burn fossil
Sure, and
fuels.
it's different now, but not that different. I mean, if you think about, I know a lot about apparel, the impact of apparel, but when you think about where have your clothes been made, you're not thinking about Rana Plaza in Dhaka, right, or in Bangladesh, or Colombia, or these other places that are doing the actual making. It's one of the things about apparel, because I do come from the industrial design side, so I learned a lot about the apparel industry and just how hard the fashion business is. But there's so much hand in every garment in this room. Somebody sewed those buttons on, sewed those seams. It's been slow to go to kind of mechanization, and it's incredible to see again how much really people are involved in the making of what you're doing. And when you look at things like fast fashion and clothing that's put out there, just like pumped out there, the resources that are being used so that you can buy a garment that maybe will last 3 wears, then it starts to fall apart, or it's sort of chilling, and we don't think about it. Like, I love that you talked about, have you thought about the chair you're sitting in? But we don't think about the clothing that we're wearing very often. Very few of you could, I would think, tell the story of the garment you're wearing right now, where it came from, where the material was farmed, what kind of dyes were used in dyeing it, what kind of finishes are on it. You might see the label made in India, or in organic, or that it's organic cotton, but that's such a small slice of what the actual story is. So in all of our companies, what we're looking at is, it's something called transparency, is really understanding for the complete lifestyle as best as possible how something was produced, where the materials came from, and sharing that story with the person who's buying the clothing.
So before we leave the BFDA, can I ask you to say a little bit more about the issue of scale? And I'm thinking here of a conversation I once had with a couple who were running a place called Raleigh Denims, Raleigh, North Carolina, the Litvienkos, Victor and Sarah Litvienko.
Yeah.
And they have a company. It's so interesting because they realized that in this part of North Carolina, which used to be a center for the garment industry, there was a lot of skill kind of kicking around and a lot of tools kicking around that weren't being used because the factories had closed. And so they put all of that to use in making these very kind of fashion-forward jeans, which they sell at Barney's, right? So there's a high-end distribution strategy.
Very high-end, yeah.
But I remember Victor saying that it was only when they found the sweet spot in terms of scale that they could be successful.
Yes.
Because they had to be big enough to be able to buy in, for example, the rolls of high-quality denim at an affordable price, but they had to be small enough that they could maintain quality.
It's a huge barrier to success, is this idea of scaling. And you do hit a sweet spot where finally you're able to buy at scales that give you the margins you need to be successful. And one of the key elements of the BFDA is our production facilities. So we produce knitwear and cut and sew, but only small run production. So our sweet spot there is 25 to 50 units, because designers can't find somebody to do quality work, especially knitwear, at those numbers. But they start by getting, Barney's. I'll never forget, it was Shannon South came to me and said, I just got an order from Barney's. They want 30 of what I'm doing. I can't afford to make them myself because I'm trying to run my business, and I can't find somebody to make it for me where I can actually make any kind of margin on it. So I don't know how I'm ever going to be successful. And I said, there's something we can do, right? And that's where the production piece became critical to the BFDA. So it's available to any designer. So you could come in and say, I'm working on this design and I need to get it produced and I need 100 of them, and we would work with you on that. Or you need 25 of them and we would work with you on that. Or you need one of them. And so we provide that resource to young designers, and we help them become better clients to manufacturers. And when they get above kind of our comfort zone for the numbers that our staff can produce, we point them to suppliers in New York City who want an order of 200 or 150. And so it helps them, these micro businesses, we call them. They're not even small businesses yet. You have to be at $500,000 really to be considered a viable small business. It's getting them from that micro level to that where they can actually start to use a lot of like financial tools and other types of assets that start to become available.
So that figure, that $500,000, that's annual turnover, or is that another
That's
figure?
gross sales.
Gross sales. Okay.
Yeah, and it becomes really sort of critical. 300,000, depending on what you're making and the cost of what you're doing, but 500,000 is a really a great start for the business to move forward. In fact, your chances of failing are, I think, 80%. Until you get to around $500,000, and then it flips, and your chances of success become 80%.
That's amazing.
Isn't it? Yeah.
It's that hurdle.
Yeah, and it's a statistic I learned fairly recently, but we always said we need to get them to $500,000. It just seemed kind of right. And then to hear that's that tipping point was really, really, really interesting.
It's really interesting to me that your sweet spot is in a way premised on the fact that the real sweet spot out there in the economy is a little bit bigger than you. So you're kind of camping out right under that level, and you saw an opportunity there.
We're trying to get them, if they want to be, investor ready. And with fashion and apparel companies, generally you have to be nearing $1 million in gross revenue in order for an investor to be interested in you, versus a tech company, right, where they want to snap you up as quickly as possible. And you can get a round of $2 million to support an app idea pretty quickly. But these young designers, it's a much harder it's just a much harder process.
Because the materiality of it is
you can, your production run can screw up. The buttons come in, they're wrong. I mean, there's, they're much more fragile. And the minute you get more sales, then you have to get another production run. So you're always chasing money.
Yep.
And we have one company that did a $250,000 in sales this past season, and he's thinking he can't get the funding to essentially take it the next level, and that he's just getting better. His business is getting more and more and more exciting, but he's getting exhausted because it's very hard for him to get financing, and he's not ready for an investor yet. So it's tough. It's really hard to be an entrepreneur.
I find it very striking that the question of scale is very dependent on the specificity of the materiality of whatever that thing is.
Right.
So it's going to be one scale that will get you there if you're doing embroidery, another one if you're doing woven textiles, another if you're doing some other trade. Can you talk a little bit about how you work with the designers, the BFDA, in relation to those questions of maximizing their own product and what they're doing materially, their craft, their trade?
Most of them have shifted from, I would say, a crafts approach. Many of them start there. Mandy Cordal, for example, started as doing kind of that hand knitting thing and then moved on to our computerized knitting machines. And so I think what's nice with starting with that craft approach is you have the touch, the material, and then as you direct it onto and into an industrialized environment, you want to maintain, and you understand how to maintain and what that touch feels like and looks like. So I think it becomes a really interesting thing to shift over. And she's done that incredibly well. So she came in, she was a brilliant designer, gorgeous work, most of it done by hand. And then, but she was a train wreck as a business person. She just didn't know what to do. She couldn't negotiate contracts. She was working part-time and then trying to do her business and just didn't know how to prioritize what to do first. And so we're able to give them essentially a plan, mostly, of how to move forward and a structure for this is what you're going to do this month. And now let's think about next month and move people through it. And 2 years later, she's negotiating contracts with Shinola, co-branding with them, and the last product that she had knit on our machines, thankfully, sold out in 4 minutes. And she's calling us going, I need more. So it's great. It's so much fun to watch people go from, again, this sort of train wreck stage to this confidence. And in fact, we're just going to talk about him on another panel on Saturday at the One Hotel, which has just opened in Brooklyn. And they came to us to design their uniforms. And Mandy ended up being the person who designed the uniform for them.
The other thing that just came up there was the question of tooling and the digital tools that you have at the BFDA. So that's clearly a value in your offering.
Yeah.
How do you think about the role of the tools that you have access to in the overall picture of the BFDA?
Well, I can think of it in a number of ways, but I think, for example, we have these Shimaseki knitting machines that are quite beautiful, and you program the design on a computer, and then you run it on the knitting machine. And there's one where similar to how you would hand knit, you knit the parts and then you link them together. And so there's a lot of labor in the linking together. I mean, the knitting's done by the machine, but you still have this handwork of linking it together. But then the other knitting machine we have knits seamlessly. So if you can imagine, it's three-dimensional knitting in essence. So my dress, if I were to knit it, would have 2 small circles and a big circle at the bottom. It would knit its way up to the neck and kind of resolve itself at the neck, and you pull it off the machine and it's done. So there's no linking, there's no handwork, it's finished. And that's a great improvement for their margins, right? Because it just reduces the cost of labor. And so with a really beautiful quality product.
Right.
Yeah.
That's another great example of how William Morris could get things wrong, because his antipathy to machines and the replacing of hands with machines,
Right.
I think blinded him to the fact that if you replace some of the more repetitive aspects of labor with a machine, then you can actually release the creative, the joyful parts
Right.
elsewhere in the same product.
It's true. But I think there also, in terms of luxury goods, and you have 3D printing and these algorithms that are generating gorgeous forms that a human probably could never even imagine. What does that do to our sense of quality and luxury? And if a machine made it, but it's gorgeous, it puts us in conflict quite a bit with that sense of hand.
And that, of course, is a 19th century dynamic that
Right.
we're reliving with our new tools. They had it with pressed
Yeah.
glass, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah, instead of cut glass.
And that's where it does feel like, this kind of going back in time in a new technological space.
So maybe that leads into our broader conversation
Uh-huh.
about what's happening in New York. I think we're supposed to be talking about New York making now.
Okay,
That's
great.
the title, right? So what do you think about when you look around the landscape in terms of production? Do you think that I'm right that there's a move to these small batch, high quality, innovation-based
Yeah, I
manufacturing
liked when you talked about
situations?
small shops and, the highly conscious mandate to innovate. I think that's absolutely a part of Brooklyn in particular. And that, you know, Brooklyn, because of its manufacturing, kind of held on to manufacturing, or has held on to it for so long, you know, maintains, you know, places where you can do these things, where you can, you know, weld steel and, you know, do glass work and these other craft-based things, as well as kind of connecting to this population of people that want to be entrepreneurs, that are technology-driven, but also feel very connected to being artisans, but using technology. So it's a really interesting mix. And I do feel that there's this this idea of being the entrepreneur, the individual, similar to being kind of an artist, connected to this idea of wanting to make money. I mean, there's a lot of people out there, young, small businesses, that really want to make money, but they're driven by the making of money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, which can, of course, be a narrative about survival, because if they don't make money, they can't make rent, and then they're gone.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily avarice
Yeah.
that's motivating them. It's often necessity, but it is a business plan.
Yeah, I think that there's, you know, there's something about, and I don't know if it's driven by social media or just, you know, that we're getting more and more connected to being, you know, recognized as an individual. I mean, our country is sort of based on that, but I think it's gotten hyper in a way with all the social media and selfies, and it's about me, 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 me. So I think that is actually a big part of where the making movement is coming from, is this idea that this is mine, I made it, but I also want to be able to buy my, you know, Raleigh denim or jeans and, you know, eat at restaurants. And so it's tied to that desire for income as well.
So it's, this definition is to do with success. Self-definition has something to do with standard of success that's maybe being imposed from outside. But you said something.
Success and stardom, and, you know, it's much more complicated.
Yeah.
I think.
But in a way, it's not an artist-based model, because, or maybe it is, but only in the sense that art is also changing.
Right.
In that, to return to the conversation about the gallery model giving way to these other strategies.
Right.
It seems to me like now the innovation is just as often in the whole business model as it is in the object that's being sold.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, I became successful by approaching the whole question of knitwear in this way, with these resources, these distribution platforms, this set of tooling, and that the innovation is more of an ecosystem that belongs to that person and is individual in that sense.
Right.
But it's not this more straightforward
very
thing
strategic.
of, I've made this beautiful thing and I'm going to put it in a gallery and hope somebody will buy it.
Yeah, you know, there's some of all of it. I think that's what's brilliant about Brooklyn.
Yeah.
You know, when you talked about the global nature of the Crystal Palace, you know, the Brooklyn feels very global in a way, and filled with kind of some of everything, which I think is great. And so but it's that rubbing shoulders. You know, it's who you're walking past, who you're connected to, you know, the fact that Jerry's there, and, you know, and then, you know, there's somebody else with, you know, that you can walk by that has, you know, as a writer or as a artist or as a, you know, a strategic, you know, planner. You know, there just is so much interaction that I think, particularly in Brooklyn, sort of crosses over, you know, in the
so
public
many,
sphere.
So many world cultures as well represented too.
Exactly, and that I think is what makes Brooklyn so interesting. You don't really find that in Manhattan as much, and I don't know the Bronx or Staten Island or Queens as well, but I know, you know, Brooklyn is. I was up in Albany, and they were talking about how everyone wants to be Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Right? Because we're doing everything we need to be doing to be creating a vital economy that is bringing young people to it, that is encouraging it to move forward, and you know, it's just economically amazing kind of thing that's happening in the state. And when you think about all of the people upstate, who are, industry has left, they have, there's not a lot for them. They all want to be another Brooklyn, and they're trying to, how do you do that?
Last thought before we turn it over to the audience. Do you see any downsides to this emergent model that we're describing? Are there things you see that drive you crazy that make you want to tear your hair out, or do you feel like it's basically an exciting lifting tide for the makers around you and your community?
I think it's an exciting lifting tide if people really pay attention to the consequences of what they're doing. But if if we don't think about, because a lot of where I'm moving into is in the integration of technology into textiles and garments, if we don't think about the consequences of what we're doing alongside what we're innovating, then we're kind of screwed. We're going to end up in the same position we are with so many other industries that are trying to figure out, how do I stop doing this? Because the consumer is saying, is asking a lot more questions about where things come from. And so I think that could be problematic. How about you?
Well, I love that answer, because the triple bottom line idea, basically there are three different types of sustainability, right? It's sustainability of your individual financial situation, sustainability of the earth, and sustainability of the social fabric.
Right.
And they all need to mesh together. And I think we have not been good at having that conversation.
No.
So that's clearly where it needs to go, but it's hard partly because it's so multivariable. At what point do you draw the line and say, okay, I'm not going to care about anything beyond this horizon of my control?
Right.
Right. If you're buying steel pipe to make a tool, then do you need to worry about where the iron was mined? Maybe so.
Yeah.
But it's a high bar that
you at least need to start
setting.
To ask the questions. If you just kind of go, most people's reaction to sustainability is, this is a tidal wave, and I'm going to turn and run, because it gets really complex very, very quickly. And, just a, simple glass of water can get really complex. It's glass, we know it's, made from sand, but how much energy went into essentially creating this shape. Well, now we're going to recycle it. The minute we, break it, we're essentially losing the embedded energy that's in the glass and the shape it is, and, where did it get made and who made it, but it gets complex so quickly. But you just have to start asking the questions. And understanding where you as a consumer can ask the place that you're buying something from, where was this made?
Can I indulge myself in a pet political theory that I have?
Sure.
I think that of all the conversations that we've had about Trump and Brexit and all the things that will happen in the last year and a half, I think one thing that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, and in my view is the single most decisive factor, is complexity. I think it's not, obviously it is about lots of other things, race, gender, antipathy to globalism, etc. But I think the most decisive factor is that things have gotten evidently complex. They were always complex, but they've gotten evidently complex, and also the level of complexity has itself increased because of multivariable connection. And it produces this sense, like you say, that people just want to run away from the tidal wave. And to me, the single most important reason that people voted for Trump, which I regard as a horrendous occurrence, is that they cannot handle the difficulty of thinking through the consequences of casting a vote anymore. And so they just go for this simple thing because it seems reassuringly straightforward. I think it's like bailing out of the situation entirely. It's not a left-right thing. It's a simple, complicated thing. Unfortunately, life is in fact complicated. So it's not going to work. But I feel like that's very, very significant, and it has everything to do with our making cultures as well. There's a David Snowden, he has this thing called the Cynefin theory, and it talks about leadership in, when things are, kind of calm and then a little bit more complicated, and then it moves to complex, and then it moves to chaos. And I think we're in a state of, and when we're in the simple,
leadership and management can really let the people being managed self-determine what's going on. When things get more complicated, you're still able to do that. When you start to get into more complex systems, you need more complex communication structures to really be working for you. And when you're in chaos, you just want a leader who's going to do it.
Yeah.
Right? And you're willing to give it over. Your need for leadership is so strong at that point and I think that Trump played into that need. We're all, the world is beyond complex, and it has moved to a chaotic state, and I think that's a lot of the reason he was able to do what he did. And there are a lot of people in distress. You can't discount, middle America and kind of working class people whose jobs have been taken away and their cities are in demise, and they don't know what their kids are going to do, and they can't draw a picture of the future. I feel so honored to be able to just sort of go, this is what the future is going to be, and I'm going to help lead into this future, and not, and that drives me and my passion forward. And I think we have a lot of those people here in the city, right? And we come here to be able to do that. And so, but how do you do that when you're, I don't know,
But that is where the discourse around making can be
Middleton,
so
Ohio.
helpful, because it's a way of making complexity concrete. Right?
Yeah.
Like you say, the glass is already complexity kind of brought into this material form.
Yeah.
So I think it does give us a great purchase on these things, super important at the minute.
Yeah.
So I think
I
we're
would love to hear
a
the
little bit of a
audience too.
diminished crowd, but are there any questions for Deb or for me, or comments? Political theories you want to share?
Yes.
Objects you made this afternoon that you'd like to pass around? Anything at all? Yeah.
I had a question. You were kind of talking about this new model of maker and how they're operating, rather than kind of solo and creating their individual pieces and going through galleries. There's a lot of objects out there, and there's kind of an explosion, it seems like, of creative designers, especially in New York, which I think is wonderful. There's also a lot of viral things that get picked up and spread around and aren't always that interesting necessarily, but kind of make it through. And I think my question is, where do you see the kind of role of curator and the kind of function of gallery, where this is a person that's, kind of working with the art community and filtering it through to the public, and where you see that kind of hints or filtered, and moving forward, what that becomes.
Yeah, I'll just briefly repeat the question. It's essentially about curating and the role of curating in an atmosphere of profusion. So you have so much stuff being made.
I see so.
How does the curator respond to that? It's a fantastic question, and one I think about all the time, sometimes late at night kind of thing. Maybe I'll answer it first, and please.
Oh, please, yeah.
But, well, a couple of things I think push curators away from having that more filtering function that you're describing. One is that people like me are getting more interested in models. So I am, in fact, much more interested in the way somebody does business than necessarily the shape of the glass, which I think is different from the previous generation of curators. And maybe I'm right or maybe I'm wrong in having that interest, but I think the curators go where the makers go often. It's a generational shift intellectually, and we're in the same kind of direction. So I'm much less interested in which museums own which objects and what the standard should be than curators I know that are a generation older than me. I just don't have that kind of acquisitiveness, and I don't consider myself to be in the business of assigning a grade to an object based on its inherent quality. I'm much more interested in the context around it, and I think that's widely shared in curators of my generation. And then, of course, the other thing, which is even a stronger effect, is that we're now in a situation where curatorial expertise, rather like the expertise of journalists or critics, is being constantly challenged by the public. and a lot of museums have been starting to experiment with crowdsourced exhibitions, or, mass voting for the best thing, or in a kind of more sophisticated way, using Wikipedia type structures to harvest information that might flow into their cataloging systems. And so you could imagine a situation where a curator is more like somebody who works at Wikipedia. In other words, not somebody that has all the information in their head, but somebody who can create a structure in which the knowledge can happen through some kind of mass group effort. And that radically changes the way that a curatorial job description would be written. So those are all things that are kind of pushing the curator away from that kind of qualitative assessment exercise that you're describing. I guess on the other hand, of course, you have, back to the confusion and chaos and complexity conversation, you have the sense that somebody needs to step in and make some decisions, so there is also a way in which in the biennials and the art fairs and et cetera, you do have a role for the curator to kind of shape things. And I think it's very interesting that curation has been adopted as a metaphor for all kinds of things. So now, menus are curated, and, we're probably getting like curated traffic light systems in New York at this point. But it's become a kind of master metaphor, like craft. I mean, you see like handcrafted condominiums, or Arby's is handcrafted now, right? So, it becomes this kind of loose metaphor, and I've seen curation used in that way. So I think it's a highly dynamic situation. I don't know where that will end up, but I think certainly it will be at least as different in 20 years as now is from 20 years ago. And I can tell you that's pretty different. And if you compare it to what a curator was doing in the 1950s or 60s, it's almost unrecognizable. So.
And do you think that's the need for, because I think it's similar in design. People have moved away from the artifact and into sort of the purpose and the reason and the context, and the story. There's always this idea that you're not, just buying, this pen. There's a story about this pen and how it got there, and we're sort of searching for the purpose of it. For me, almost to an extreme. I start to get a little it's just, how many stories do I have? Like everything's got a story, right? But it's interesting that that is being reflected in sort of business of design as well.
Yeah, I think curation also is becoming more of a storytelling profession. So for certainly the V&A, for example, we thought a lot about the stagecraft, and I got, in other words, what did the room look like? What was the kind of exhibition presentation strategy? And we had very ambitious, expensive 3D and 2D design that backed up our selections. It's kind of opposite of a white cube approach, huge monitors and music and, sometimes proximity sensors, et cetera. And I got to the point where I was almost thinking about the objects as more like, it's more like, I don't know, like ammunition or like instruments that you have in your orchestra. And it's like, then how can you use them? And I would almost think about selecting an object more for what it could do within a piece of stagecraft, like a prop in a theater production, that kind of thing. Very different from thinking about its inherent object and, this is the first, best, rarest, that kind of approach.
Like that makes me think of kind of like Rick Owens, for instance, creating kind of like this overarching atmosphere and kind of lifestyle where his stuff is beautiful on its own, but when you kind of layer it into like spaces, his furniture is kind of like aura, and it becomes more about like the storytelling.
Yeah.
Rather than the individual objects.
It's
Yeah.
about the relationships rather that are created between. My background's exhibit design, but interpretive exhibit, so it was always narrative space, and it was always telling a story through the objects rather than really about the objects themselves.
Maybe a question here, then Anne. Yeah.
I was just wondering what you might think about the tendency of new design museums, like the one in London, or the renovation to the Cooper Hewitt, which seems to take a model from science museums with lots of buttons and videos, and it just seems like people, and earphones. I'm not
That's because I wouldn't let them. Yeah.
But, you know, I find it rather daunting.
Yeah.
They've sort of wrecked the Hewitt by the second floor, and the new design museum in London seems a mess. Some places do it well, but, you know, it's like at one point everything was Sonny Lumiere, no matter where you went. Or it was the same video. I was just wondering what your take on it was as far as the tendency of design museums. They seem like advertising,
Yeah.
you know, performances rather than, you know, sort of intelligent descriptions or, you
Yeah.
know, understanding of it. You know, sort of go to a place like Munich and design museum, you can understand it. But, you know, my experience lately has been rather disastrous. Just wondering what you thought about it since you worked at the V&A and at, you know, at Atlanta.
And in fact, I'm, as it happens, I'm curating the Designs of the Year show for the London Design Museum this year. So I've been thinking about that very question. I would say that, without casting aspersions on the Cooper Hewitt or the Design Museum in any sense, I share your intuition on a fundamental level, which is that, as you can tell, I'm very interested in actual material encounters, and I think that museums are very good places to do that. And I somewhat lament the trend of museums to try to compete with the experiences that people are having that are screen-based anyway. So particularly the Cooper Hewitt with those massive touch screens, which, you know, the only thing that those have over this is size, right? They're basically the same thing, but giant scale. And I can see why they would do that, partly because they, after all, are an industrial design museum, so they maybe feel like they have to somehow register the tendencies of the time, technologically speaking. But so maybe it's appropriate there more than anywhere else, and I would buy that argument. But even so, you know, for me personally, I mean, I'm a person who never takes an audio tour, never uses an interactive, I mean, that's not me. But I think that there are so few opportunities in our culture to create these extremely intense encounters with a material object on its own terms. And I just, something in me dies inside, you know, when I see museums becoming awash with technology. So what I'm thinking of doing for the Designs of the Year show, you heard it here first, people. Those of you who did come tonight are rewarded with a sneak peek. What I'm thinking of doing for the Designs of the Year show is creating these very large kind of masses of material from which things are made. So fibers or metal or wood, and then sort of embedding the objects in them as these kind of sculptural things. No screens, no tech, just totally palpable things, and hopefully they'll go for that, because you know, I feel like there's a hunger for it too. So I think Anne was next.
Funny you bring that up, because I only ever use the interactives to judge the interactive as opposed to learn anything about anything else.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's what I'm thinking.
Occupational hazard. Yeah.
But my question was actually more, so my little pet theory is that it's not an uncommon one, I think, so we have artisanal fatigue. It doesn't mean what it used to mean. It's big cash, term.
Yeah.
So I think we're moving into more of a tech, if there's another moment coming, maybe like the artisanal moment, maybe the tech moment. But I think it's a responsible tech moment, sort of driven by a desire for efficiency. And I'm curious, you mentioned that you know, there's the grant and everything involved. And I'm curious what types of tech, what techniques you see maybe driving something like that, if you buy my whole theory that maybe we're moving towards that.
Well, I think, you know, one of the things that we've found, because we're working with sustainability and technology so closely, is, you know, the sustainability people hate the tech people, and the tech people think the sustainability people are, you know, like, and, you know, backward. And that our goal is really to bring those two things together, because technology is coming, it's here, it's growing, and it will be part of the solution. And so you have to get those two communities speaking with each other. But in terms of the actual technology, I mean, the kinds of technology that we're looking at, or?
You mentioned the time it took to make the
Mm-hmm.
knitwear
Right.
in one go.
Right.
That to me seems like it could be, that's the type of thing I'm talking about.
Right.
I'm curious about more stuff.
So there's a lot of digitization of the manufacturing equipment that's happening. So, now you can program a knitting machine in a different way than they used to use punch cards, similar to a computer, and then you would hand do it and the card would go through. And so it's just a mechanization. One of the things we're bringing in is a jacquard loom that's digitized. So the computer is taking away kind of some of the task or tediousness of understanding, what, I don't know the technical terms for it, what strings go up and what strings stay
Do you
down.
know how to remember this for the rest of your life?
Yes, please.
The weft goes weft to white.
Oh.
Lord,
The web. So I guess the word. Thank you. I will remember that forever, and I'll use it again a number of times during my tours. But so it's the warp that goes up and down,
Yeah.
and the weft. So the computer is sort of doing that for you rather than having to do the foot pedals and all of that. So you're able to get things done more quickly, which is, I think, where technology has been good for us, right? Is for better, or for worse, maybe. But this idea of being able to speed up the things we don't want to do. I think there's a new transformation. I think a lot of that's going to come through biotech, where we're really going to shift. It's going to transform to something really new and different. So there's a company called Bolt Threads that makes something called spider silk, and it's a fermentation process in a closed loop system that's making silk. It uses sugar, water, and yeast primarily, and some chemistry, but they get silk. I mean, you couldn't sort of under a microscope really distinguish it from a natural silk, and it has all the same properties. So, and they'll be able to do that with other materials like cotton. So when you get to cotton, you get into the history of cotton and clothing, and I mean, that's just kind of an amazing sort of, I never realized how important cotton was to the world economies. But so all of a sudden, I don't have to farm cotton anymore. That's transformation. And that's sustainability in a new way. And that's when I get really excited about, we do have the answers. We're getting closer and closer. But they're also going to be world-changing answers in terms of how our commodities are going to be produced.
It's a perfect triple bottom line example, too, because cotton is so water hungry, and we're going to be facing huge water shortages. So,
definitely.
Yeah.
And you'll be able to essentially build in the finishing, or hydrophobic qualities of a material. So they'll be able to make really beautiful silk that you don't get the oil stain on, right? And then it's ruined. And I don't know, that's the thing somebody could really teach me, is how to get that oil stain out of my silk shirt. But you've got that one?
No, I think
Like, yes. I think that's where in terms of real transformation, I think it's in the bio area that we're going to see a lot of that. Right now, I think we're just trying to do things more efficiently, but we're just ending up doing more of it more efficiently, and it's not going to really, it's not going to change the problem.
I think we have time for one last question, if there is one.
I just have more of a comment.
Yeah, Caroline.
But that's the kind of thing that could have been awarded at the Crystal Palace for, this amazing, very particular.
Oh, interesting. Mm-hmm.
And just thinking, so many of these manufacturers, really only existed for a very short period of time. And the ceramics, which I'm more familiar with, these were already Tucson scale, but they were able to exhibit their works. But it was such a representation of capital to be able to garner the materials, the skilled labor, the just the production chains, and the levels of skilled labor, because it was all division of labor within these factories.
Mhm.
all that skill and distributing the works. But this was, really a high point in ceramics industry between the two low points economically because, many of the manufacturers disappeared within a few years because they couldn't sustain that. And thinking about what you do and getting people even to that stage is really fascinating. And how did these companies even get to, from the micro level to small business and beyond?
And for me, it's critical because the talent is in the micro people,
Yeah.
right? All the innovation, all the, where it's going, all the kind of bravado and gutsiness and risk taking, it's there. And if we can't support it to the point where it can then sort of go on its own and be viable, we're just losing all that talent. And for me, that's really where all of my passion comes from, is let's get that stuff out there.
Yeah, which of course was the intention behind the New York Crystal Palace as
Sure.
well. So
Right,
that's
right.
it still does bring us full circle. It's just that it's a very different strategy for
Yeah.
supporting it.
Great.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming and listening. Thank you very much, Deb.
Thank you, that was lovely.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.